The U.S. military has been busy with direct and indirect involvement in several conflicts and military developments around the globe. America is helping support Ukraine for its war in Russia and in the Middle East, where there are concerns Iran could attack Saudi Arabia infrastructure.
The tensions are also growing in Eastern Asia, right? Got to expand this map between the U.S. and both China and North Korea. So let's bring in Michael O'Hanlon. He's a senior fellow and director of research of foreign policy, the foreign policy program, I should say, at the Brookings Institution. He's also a member of the Defense Policy Board for the U.S. Department of Defense. Thank you for being with us. And, you know, this is the type of question you could ask any day of any year. But how is the Defense Department handling deployments of U.S. forces in various locations with so many different types of conflicts brewing right now?
Greetings. Nice to be with you. Well, I don't know that the scale of deployments is that much greater than is the norm, even though, as you rightly say, there seem to be a lot of exercises going on at this particular moment. And, you know, it's always a fine line. When you bring young people into the military, they actually often want to go abroad. They benefit from intensive exercise and training at certain points, and alliances are given a real kind of, you know, muscle and reality and closeness when you have these sorts of exercises. On the other hand, you don't want to overdo it. You don't want to work people too hard. But for the most part, we're doing these exercises and deployments with people who are already in the region. So just in rough numbers, we've got close to 100,000 U.S. troops of various services in Northeast Asia, about 100,000 in Europe, and then about 50,000 in the broader Middle East. So that's a total of 250,000, very small numbers elsewhere. And that's out of a total active duty force of 1.3 million. So it's, you know, almost a fifth of the total. But most of those forces are actually based, permanently stationed in the overseas countries where they are essentially operating or close to where they're operating now. So we have a lot of U.S. forces based in Japan, a lot based in Korea. Sometimes they're there without their families. Sometimes they're there with their families. So there is potentially a certain strain on people in that regard. But again, this is always a balancing act. The U.S. military likes to be busy. They just don't want to be too busy. I think they're probably okay at managing the set of deployments because, of course, bear in mind, we don't have any additional 100,000 troops in Iraq or Afghanistan anymore. Yeah. So that burden is largely gone.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting, Michael, because as you say, we don't actually have these deployments. We're not actively fighting in a war, but there are all these flashpoints around the world in which America is involved, at least at a support level. Ukraine obviously comes to mind. It's sending arsenal. The U.S. military is providing training. But there's also the possibility of them needing to quickly respond, as we're talking about bright lines in the Korean peninsula, as we're talking about the possibility of further engagements with China and Taiwan, Russia, Ukraine. How is the Defense Department managing all of its assets with sort of that uncertainty?
That's an excellent question. I really do think that day to day we're fine for the kinds of reasons I just gave. But if there were a war or a major crisis, and in light of the fact the Pentagon just released its national defense strategy just in recent days, that national defense strategy does not call for us to be able to fight two overseas wars at the same time anymore. And through the post-World War II period, we sort of alternated between being able to fight or trying to be able to have the force structure to be able, in theory, to fight two at a time, and sometimes backing off that standard. At this point, we're assuming we would not fight both Russia and China at the same time. In fact, we wouldn't fight Russia and North Korea at the same time. So we've gotten away from a two-war framing. I think that's generally speaking okay, because I'd rather see us focus on quality of the force and on high readiness and on modernization of the force and deterrence. But, you know, all that hinges on not having something big blow up in our face, whether in one of the places we might expect or in some other place. And so it is a little bit of a risky strategy. You know, it already costs $850 billion a year just to maintain that strategy and that force structure. So we'd be well over $1 trillion if we really wanted to fight two wars at the same time or have that capability. So that's hence the decision the Pentagon's just made.
And not to mention the human cost. You know, there is, you know, and I should be transparent. One of the reasons I'm in the U.S. is because my American stepfather was in the Air Force, the U.S. Air Force. My mother married him, and we moved from England to the States. And I can remember clearly when he was deployed to the first Gulf War and watching CNN and those green images and just how transfixed I was, hoping he would make it home safely. He did. But as you mentioned, there's not as much will for U.S. forces to be in Iraq, to be in Afghanistan. That's why those things have been wound down. What is the likelihood that there would be that the U.S. would get pulled into another war, or more than one war, considering that lack of U.S. appetite because of the human toll?
And we should always, as you say, bear in mind that potential human toll. Well, I think a lot of our commitments are backed up by standing American military presence. And so part of why we do that is to make it quite credible that we would fight, because in the opening days of an aggression by an enemy, we'd be implicated. Our forces would probably be hit. Our people would probably suffer casualties, even without any decision to reinforce them from normal peacetime conditions. So that's the logic behind having these forces forward stationed, forward deployed in Korea, in Japan, in Germany, Poland, et cetera. You point out the Middle East is an area where, even if there's no way we're going to keep more than 100,000 forces in Iraq and or Afghanistan indefinitely. It wouldn't have made any sense. I think we should have kept 5,000 in Afghanistan. So on that point, I disagree with President Biden. But I think the big uncertainty in the Middle East, of course, is Iran. And if Iran were to make an explicit run for a nuclear weapon, and they're inching in that direction these days, but not making a full sprint, we would have a terrible and tough decision as to whether to try to set that back with a concerted period of airstrikes and then, wonder what would come next by way of possible escalation, or whether to tolerate the Iranian acquisition of the bomb. I think we would probably conduct the airstrikes, but that would be extraordinarily risky, as you say.
And obviously the U.S. isn't going to tip its hand as to what that strategy would be, in part to keep that deterrence option available. Michael O'Hanlon, thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
My pleasure.